The wind came out of the northwest at 60 miles an hour, and the thermometer on the porch post read 29 below. Harlan Vexley knotted one end of a rope around the post and the other end around his waist. Behind him in the barn, a cow was calving backward. Mara Ellery stood in the doorway with her father's leather ledger held against her chest, the cover already dark with wet. Somewhere out in that white past the fence line, the son of the man who wanted her ruined was lost in the snow. Harlan pulled his collar up. "Keep the lantern in the window," he said. Then he stepped off the porch and the storm took him. 6 weeks earlier, this man had knocked on her door to ask for a cup of milk. The road into Coldwater Reach ran along a dry creek bed, and Harlan Vexley walked it with his daughter on his hip and his son a half step behind him, because the boy would not walk in front and would not fall back. Nell had been crying since the morning. By afternoon, the crying had gone hoarse and thin, which frightened him more than the noise had. Eli carried the tool sack without being asked. It was too heavy for a 9-year-old, and the boy had shifted it to his other shoulder 4 times in the last mile and had not once set it down. The woman came out of the house before they reached the gate. She had a shotgun in the crook of her arm, held the way a person holds a thing they have carried so often they have stopped noticing the weight of it, and she stopped 40 feet off and looked at them. Harlan stopped too. "That's close enough," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the man, and then at the boy, and then at the child on his hip who had turned her face into his coat. The barrel came down slowly and pointed at the frozen ground between them. "What do you want?" "Milk," Harlan said. "For the baby. That's all I came up here for. You can ask me anything you want after. Milk first." Something moved across her face that she did not let stay there. She turned and walked back toward the house, and at the door she looked over her shoulder and jerked her chin, which was as much of an invitation as she had in her. She poured the milk in the kitchen from a crock in the cold pantry and set the cup on the table in front of Eli, who did not touch it until his father nodded, and then who did not drink it, but held it while Harlan tipped it carefully to Nell's mouth. On the shelf behind her shoulder there were 2 china cups, the same pattern, the same size. One of them had a broken handle. She did not touch either of them, and Harlan did not ask. "Now," she said, sitting down across the table. "Who are you?" "Harlan Vexley." "That isn't what I asked. I'm Mara Ellery, and this is my place, and I'd like to know who's standing in my kitchen." He understood what she was really asking. He waited for her to come at it, where he had come from, and who had sent him, and what a man does to end up walking a creek road in the first week of November with 2 children and a tool sack. She asked none of it. "What can you do?" she said. "Carpentry, ironwork rough. Wells pumps anything that carries water, stone if you've got mortar. I can shoe a horse, but not well." She heard him out with the flat patience of somebody who has been promised things before. When he finished, she said nothing at all, and the silence in the kitchen went on long enough that Eli looked up. Harlan turned his head toward the window. "Your barn door hangs about 3/4 of an inch off true," he said. "North corner. That means the wind comes under it every night. That means your cattle burn hay to stay warm instead of putting on weight. And that means you run out of feed in February instead of April." Mara looked at the window and then at him. "Anybody can say a thing like that?" "Yes, ma'am." "That's why I'd rather fix it than say it." She stood up and went to the stove and stood with her back to the room for a while, and when she turned around, her face had decided something her voice had not caught up to yet. "You've got 1 week," she said. They slept that night in the hay barn, which was warmer than the house Harlan had expected and colder than the house he had hoped for. He laid Nell in the straw with his coat over her. Eli lay on his side with his eyes open. "Why couldn't we stay at the last place?" the boy said. "Because they didn't have work." "That's not what the man said." Harlan looked at the low roof. 3 ranches had turned him away before this one, and his son had stood beside him at every gate and had heard every word, so there was no version of it worth building. "The 4th one had work," he said. "Man offered it to me straight. Good wage room over the tack house." "Then why?" "Because the room was for one. He said his hands don't bring family. He said there's a county home in Cheyenne takes children. Eli did not ask anything else. He sat up after a minute and dug in his coat pocket and came out with half a piece of cornbread wrapped in a scrap of cloth gone hard at the edges. He had been carrying it 2 days. He held it out. "Eat it," Harlan said. "You didn't have any." "Eat it, son." The boy ate it in small pieces, turned away the way a person eats when they have learned that food is a thing you should not be seen to need. In the corner of the barn under the tarp with the rest of what they owned was a cradle Harlan had started building 2 winters ago and had never finished. The headboard was sanded smooth. The rails were still rough sawn. He had carried it out of the last town on the wagon and had never once picked up a plane and finished it. He started on the barn door the next morning. Silas Greeley rode in on the 3rd day with his boy alongside him. He was a big man gone comfortable, and he came into the yard slow, looking at the fence line, looking at the stack yard, taking an inventory that he did not bother to hide. Harlan was carrying water from the pump. Silas rode past him at a distance of about 3 feet and did not look at him and drew up in front of Mara. "Heard you took on help." "I did." "Cheap help from the look of it." Silas smiled at her with real warmth as though he had paid her a compliment and expected to be thanked for it. "I'm glad for you, Mara, truly. It's a hard year to be short." He talked for a while about the weather and about the price of beef, and then in the same easy manner he mentioned that the 1st of December was coming on and that he'd heard Edwin March was making his rounds for the county before the 15th. He said both dates the way a man mentions the time to somebody who is already late. Then he turned his horse. Behind him, his son Noah rode past the pump and put his boot against the full bucket Harlan had just set down and tipped it into the mud. Harlan looked at the spreading water. He did not look up at the boy. Silas saw the whole of it. He said nothing to his son, and the 2 of them rode out through the gate at a walk. The barn door took him 2 days. He pulled the hinges planed, the jamb shimmed the sill, and rehung the whole of it, and on the 2nd evening Mara came out with her father's steel rule and measured the gap herself, top and bottom, north corner and south. It was true. She folded the rule and put it in her apron pocket. "There's a stove in the back room," she said. "It draws poorly. You and the children can have it." That was how he came to stay. He walked the boundary that same evening while there was still light, because that was what he did with a place he read it the way other men read a newspaper. The stackyard was sound. The creek gate wanted a new latch. Then he came around the northwest shoulder of the pasture and stopped. There was a windbreak there, a double row of old willow planted by her father or her father's father, running along the high ground where the weather came in. It had been a good row once. Now 3 sections of it were broken out at the base, the stumps gone soft and hollow, and near the top of the rise, the row simply ended, and there was nothing across the better part of 40 yards but open ground and wind. He stood and looked at it until the light went. He worked out what it would take, and he worked out what it would cost, and he worked out how long the ground would stay soft enough to set new posts. Then he walked back to the house, and he ate supper, and he did not say a word about it to Mara Ellery. Some things a man puts off are not put off out of idleness. They are put off because something else that day looks more urgent. Winter has never been able to tell those 2 apart. The work went in the order that water goes. He started with the tank at the head of the lane, because a cow that cannot drink will not eat, and a cow that will not eat burns hay to keep her own heat. And hay was the one thing on the place that could not be replaced before spring. The pipe ran shallow from the spring box, and it had frozen every winter Mara could remember, and every winter her father had gone out with a bar and a kettle and beaten the ice out of it, and had counted that as maintenance. Harlan dug the run down 3 feet and packed it with straw and dry manure, and he built a wooden cap over the trough with a hinged flap that the cattle themselves pushed open with their noses so the surface never sat still long enough to skin over. It took him 4 days and cost nothing but labor and 1 hinge. After that, he rebuilt the feed racks so the hay fell into a trough instead of onto the ground, because 1/3 of everything they fed was being walked into the mud. After that, he chinked the north wall of the house, working the mortar in with his thumbs, where the old daubing had crumbled out between the logs. Each of those jobs made the next one smaller. That was the thing about the way he worked, and Mara Ellery, watching from the porch with her arms folded, began to see it before she was willing to say so. "Fix the water and you save the hay. Save the hay and the cattle come through heavier. Cattle that come through heavier calve without help." It was not a series of repairs. It was one long argument, and every day he was adding another line to it. 3 times in those 2 weeks, he walked out to the northwest shoulder in the last of the light and stood in front of the broken willow row. 3 times he turned around and went back to something else. He rode into town on the second Saturday for wire and nails. The store was warm and smelled of kerosene and cured leather, and there was a rancher at the counter ahead of him buying a keg of nails and a coil of rope, and Harlan stood back and waited while the storekeeper wrote the whole of it in the account book and said he would see him after the first of the year. Then it was Harlan's turn. "Fence wire," he said. 3 rolls, 6 pounds of 10-penny nails. The storekeeper named a price for the wire that was better than a third above what the man ahead of him had been charged, and he named it without any particular malice, the way a man states a fact of arithmetic. "Cash," he said. "I don't carry accounts I don't know." Harlan stood with his hand flat on the counter and did the sum in his head, and it was not a long sum. He had the wages Mara had paid him for the first 2 weeks and nothing else in the world. 1 roll, he said. "And the nails." He counted the coins out and did not hurry over it, and did not say anything else, and carried the roll out to the wagon on his shoulder. The cold came down hard that night. It came out of the northwest with a low sound in the eaves, and by 9 o'clock the back room where the children slept had a draft moving across the floor that a man could feel on his ankles. Nell woke up, coughing. Not badly, but with that wet catch at the bottom of it that Harlan had heard once before in another house in another winter, when Eli was 4 years old, and there had been 3 nights nobody in that house had slept. He stood in the doorway with the lantern and looked at the gap where the wall met the sill. There was 1 roll of wire in the wagon. The willows needed it, and needed it now, because he could brace the 3 broken sections with wire and cross poles and buy them another season, and after the ground froze, there would be no setting anything at all. He had maybe 10 days. He knew that as clearly as he knew his own name. He also had a 14-month-old child coughing in a room with wind coming through the wall. He took the wire out to the back room, and he strapped lath across the gap and wired it tight to the sill plate and packed the whole of it with mortar and rag, and it was past midnight when he finished. The draft stopped. Nell slept. He stood in the doorway a long time, watching her breathe. 3 weeks, he told himself. Snow doesn't set in before December. I'll find another roll. He sat down at the table afterward with the stub of a pencil and the notebook he had carried since he was 19, and he wrote down what he had done that day, the way he had written down every day of work for 15 years. Water cap finished. Feed racks. North wall, chinked back room lathed and sealed. Then he looked at the rest of the page. He did not write the word willow. He closed the notebook on a page that was 2/3 empty, and he put it in his coat, and he went to bed. 2 of the neighbors came out in the middle of November on the pretext of a strayed heifer that nobody had actually lost. They sat their horses in the yard and would not come in, and they talked to Mara about the weather and about Silas Greeley's new bull, and the whole time their eyes went past her shoulder to the man up on the barn roof replacing shakes. "You counting your stock regular?" the older one said at last. He said it pleasantly. He said it in a voice that could be defended afterward in front of anybody as neighborly concern. Mara did not look up at the roof. "I count every evening," she said. "They're all there." The 2 men touched their hats and rode out, and Harlan came down off the ladder and said nothing about it, because there was nothing in what she had said that was about him. She had defended her own count. That was all she had defended. He understood the difference. He had spent his whole life understanding the difference. Noah Greeley caught Eli at the fence line in the 3rd week of November on a gray afternoon with the light already going at 4 o'clock. The boy had been sent down to the creek gate with a bucket, and Noah came along the road on his father's roan and turned it sideways so it filled the gap, and looked down at him and said the things he said. They were not his own words. Eli could hear that in them the way you can hear a grown man's voice coming out of a boy who has memorized it at a kitchen table, and that was somehow worse. Eli stood there with the bucket in both hands. He had half a piece of cornbread in his coat pocket wrapped in cloth. He had put it there that morning out of habit, the way he had put food in his pocket at every place they had ever stayed, because you never knew, and his hand went to it and pressed it flat against his chest so it would not show. He did not answer. He did not look up. When the horse moved, he went around it and kept walking because his father had told him in 3 different towns, in the same even voice each time, "Don't give anybody a reason." Harlan watched the whole of it from the stack yard 200 yards off with a pitchfork in his hands. He did not go down there. Going down there would have finished them at Coldwater Reach inside a day, and he knew it, and he stood and let it happen, and felt something in his chest turn over and lie still. At supper that night, he could not eat. Mara noticed and did not ask. She told him about the water agreement on the 19th of November, the evening before the county man was due over the kitchen table with the lamp between them. Her father had died 3 years back in the fall and had left her the place with a good house and a bad well. The well had gone alkali the following spring. Digging a new one meant money she did not have, and the only sweet water inside of 9 miles was the Coldwater itself, and the stretch of it that ran reliable in a dry year lay on Silas Greeley's ground above her. He had been kind about it. That was the part she kept coming back to. He had been kind, and he had come to the funeral, and he had sat in that same chair and drawn up an agreement that let her run water down the ditch to her pasture in exchange for a yearly payment she could just about carry, and she had signed it in the presence of a lawyer from the county seat who had been recommended to her by Silas Greeley. There was a clause on the second page. If she missed a payment, or if the place was ever graded unfit for grazing by the county, he had the right to buy the strip along the creek at a price set 3 years ago in a good year. "He gave me his hand on it," she said. I remember thinking, that was the part that mattered. Harlan turned the cup in his fingers. "You can pay the first no." She said it without any change of face at all. "The payment's $72. I've got 32. I'll ask him for time and he'll give me time because time isn't what he wants. He wants the 15th. She looked at the lamp for a while. "I'm not afraid of losing this place," she said. "I'm afraid of trusting the wrong man a second time and then losing it. Those aren't the same thing." Harlan had the words in his mouth. "There is a windbreak on your northwest shoulder that is 3 sections gone and 40 yards short, and I have known it since the 4th day, and I spent your wire on my daughter's wall." He drank the last of his coffee and said goodnight. Edwin March came up the lane on the 20th of November in a county buggy with a folding rule and a satchel of forms. He was not an unkind man, and he did not pretend to be a friendly one. He walked the whole place in 3 hours with Mara beside him and Harlan a few steps behind, and he wrote in his book at every stop, and what he wrote down was true. The water cap was ingenious. The feed racks were sound. The barn was tight. At the end of it, he stood by his buggy and gave them his preliminary finding in the flat voice of a man reading a weather report. "I'll be recording indications of unstable management," he said. "The place has a history. 2 bad grades in your father's last years, ma'am, and the file doesn't care whose time it was. And you're operating without certified labor of record." "The work's done," Mara said. "You've seen it." "I've seen it in November." March closed the book. "A board doesn't sit in a pasture. It sits in a room in town and reads." Harlan spoke for the first time that afternoon. "What kind of proof does it read?" March looked at him and looked at him properly, which was more than most men in that county had done. "Facts before opinions," he said. "Numbers, with dates on them." The buggy went down the lane and around the bend by the willows and out of sight. Harlan sat down on the porch step and opened his notebook on his knee and understood finally and completely a thing he had known for 20 years, without ever once saying it to himself in words. Edwin March did not hate him. March believed in paper, and paper had never yet stood on the side of the people who were required to prove more than everybody else in order to be counted as the same. He turned to a blank page. If a man will only believe what can be written down, then he would write down more than the whole county put together. The thing had changed shape, and both of them felt it. It was no longer a question of whether Coldwater Reach could live through the winter. It was a question of whether it could be shown to have lived through it by system rather than by luck in a room in town on the 15th of December in front of men who would never set foot on the ground. Mara went into the house and came back with a ledger bound in brown leather worn pale at the corners, her father's handwriting on the first 40 pages and nothing after. "He kept it up until the week he died," she said, and put it in Harlan's hands. From that evening on, he wrote everything. Morning temperature and evening temperature off the porch thermometer. Pounds of hay fed by rack. The hour the tank was checked and whether it was open. Every animal that came off feed and what was done and whether it worked. He weighed calves on a set of scales he rebuilt out of a broken cotton beam and wrote the weights down with the date beside them. The ledger was a weapon. He knew that. He also knew every single night when he opened it that between that book and the notebook in his coat, there was not one page written since the day he arrived on which the words "Northwest Windbreak" appeared even once. On the 1st of December, Mara rode over to the Greeley place with $32 and asked for time on the balance. Silas gave it to her graciously over coffee and mentioned nothing more. 4 days later, she learned that he had filed a petition with the county board asking that the Ellery grading be taken up at the earliest sitting rather than in the spring rotation. The clock pulled tight. Harlan found the boundary stakes on the 6th. He was walking the creek line with the ledger under his arm, checking the ditch head for ice, and something about the shape of the ground did not agree with the marks. He went down the fence and found the first stake, and then the second, and then the third, and all three of them had been pulled and reset something better than 30 yards inside the Ellery line, which put the whole reliable stretch of the ditch head on the other man's side of the paper. There were no witnesses. There was nobody within 4 miles. The ground was frozen hard enough that even the sod plugs had been tamped back down neat. Mara came out when he told her and stood looking at the stakes with her jaw set. "I know who did it," she said, "and I can't prove a word of it." Harlan crouched by the third stake with his hand flat on the ground. "Don't move them," he said. "They're wrong. They're wrong today. Anybody can say a thing is wrong today." He took the ledger out from under his arm, and he measured and he paced and he drew the fence line and the creek and the old sod plugs and the new ones on a clean page with distances marked in feet and the compass bearings written along the margins. He noted the depth of the fresh holes and the color of the packed earth at the bottom of them, which was dark and soft, and the color of the ground alongside which was frozen gray. Then he signed his name under the drawing and wrote the date and the hour and turned the book so she could see it. "Now it's wrong on the 6th of December, he said, "at 10 in the morning with a witness." Mara Ellery looked at the page for a long moment, and when she looked up at him, something in her face had moved a good deal further than it had ever moved before. It was the first time anybody had beaten Silas Greeley at anything, and it had been done with a pencil. The cold broke through on the 9th. Harlan came out at 4 in the morning to a wind that took the breath sideways out of a man's mouth, and the old pipe below the spring box had split a clean burst along 6 feet of it where the water had stood. In any other year, that would have been the end of water until March. The tank was open. The cap had held the heat, the straw packing had held the line, and 81 head drank at first light without a bucket being carried. He wrote it down at 7 o'clock, with his hands still shaking from the cold. Old line failed at spring box. New run intact. Full water, no losses. The heifer started calving the same night 4 weeks early. She was a small red thing that should not have been bred at all, and she went down in the corner of the barn about 11 and made no progress for an hour, and Mara came out to the lantern light with her hair loose and her father's coat over her nightdress. There was no room in that corner for two people, and there was no way for one person to do it. They worked together for the better part of 3 hours, kneeling in the straw, her hands and his hands and the rope and the slow, terrible patience of it, and neither of them said more than 10 words the whole time, and none of the 10 were about anything but the animal. The calf came at 2:15. It was small and it was alive. They sat back against the stall boards side by side, and Harlan felt her shoulder against his arm and the shake of her breathing, and after a while she got up and went into the house. He came in at dawn to write the entry. She had the coffee on. She set his cup down in front of him without a word, and went back to the stove, and Harlan looked at it and did not move for a moment. It was china. It had a broken handle. He put his hand around it and drank his coffee and asked her nothing at all, and she stood at the stove with her back to him and let him. On the 10th, the wind came around hard into the northwest and stayed there. Harlan walked out to the shoulder in the afternoon with his hat in his hand because the wind would not let him keep it on. The 3 broken sections stood open. Past the crest, the 40 yards of nothing ran along the high ground with the grass laid flat. He worked it out one more time, standing there, though he had worked it out a dozen times before. 2 days and 3 men and enough wire. That was the whole of what it needed. He had 1 day and no wire, and himself. He walked back down to the house and hung his coat by the door and asked Eli about the calf and did not say a word about the willows to anybody. Silas came on the 11th alone in the middle of the morning. He did not get down off his horse for a long time, and when he did, he took his hat off in the doorway and sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded like a man come to help. "I'll say it plain," he said. "There's no pleasure in this for me. Buy or sell, we've been neighbors 20 years. Mara stood by the stove and did not sit down. "Say it then. Sell me the creek strip. Today at the price on the paper. You keep the house, you keep the home pasture, you keep every head of stock out there." He turned his hat slowly by the brim. "You'd be shut of the payment. You'd be shut of the grading because the board doesn't grade a place that's changed its boundary. It would be finished by dinner and there'd be no more of this. And the water. You'd have water off my ditch as long as I've got any." He let that sit, and then he said the rest of it without any change in his face at all, looking at the tabletop. "And you wouldn't have to carry the responsibility, Mara, if something happened to those 2 children out here this winter. That's not a thing I'd want on my conscience. I don't believe it's a thing you'd want on yours." The stove ticked. "I'll give you my answer on the 15th, Mara said. Silas Greeley put his hat on and thanked her for the coffee he had not drunk and went out into the yard. He stopped at his horse and looked north, up the long rise at the Willow Row standing broken against a white sky. He looked at it for the better part of a minute, the way a man looks at a debt that is going to pay itself. Then he smiled and got up and rode home and said nothing to anybody. The Whitehorn blizzard came down on the night of the 12th of December. It arrived without much warning at 7 in the evening, a gray wall coming off the high country, and by 9, the wind was running at 60 miles an hour out of the northwest, and the temperature on the porch post had gone to 29 below. It hit the northwest shoulder first. The Willow Row took it for perhaps 40 minutes, and then the 3 broken sections went over one after another, with a sound nobody in the house heard over the wind, and the wind came through the gaps and through the 40 open yards and down the slope in a single unbroken sheet, and it carried the snow with it and drove that snow straight into the yard and began to pile it foot by foot against the south face of the barn where the door was. At 10:30, the black cow in the second stall started to calve backward. At 11, Noah Greeley's roan came into the Coldwater yard with the reins broken and the saddle empty and ice standing on its flanks. His father had sent him out at 4 in the afternoon to check the stakes along the creek before the weather turned, and he had not come home, and the horse had come here because it was the nearest lit place in 9 miles. Mara stood in the kitchen holding the lantern and looked at Harlan, and Harlan looked at the window and could see nothing through it at all. Then he told her. He told her standing in the middle of the kitchen floor, with his hands at his sides in the plain, flat voice he used for facts because it was the only voice he had for it, that he had seen the windbreak on the fourth day, the evening she gave him the back room, that he had known what it would take and had known how long the ground would stay soft, that he had gone to town and had money for 1 roll of wire instead of 3, and that he had used that roll on the wall of the room where his daughter slept and had told himself there were 3 weeks left, and that he had sat at this table that same night and written down everything he had done and had not written down the one thing he had not. Mara heard the whole of it without moving. "You hid it from me," she said. "I hid it from myself." She did not answer. She crossed the floor to him and crouched down and took the loose end of the rope at his waist and pulled the knot tighter than it needed to be and held it there a second with both hands. People like to believe that hiding a thing is a way of protecting themselves. Most of the time, it is only a way of putting off the shame until the day the price has gone up. She stood and opened the kitchen door, and the wind came in across the floorboards and laid the lantern flame over sideways in its glass. Owning a mistake while it can still be mended costs a man 1 evening. Owning it after it has broken costs a great deal more than that. There were 3 things that had to be done, and there was 1 man to do them. Harlan stood in the open doorway with the rope on his waist and made the count out loud because saying it aloud was how he had always kept himself from lying to himself, and he had learned in the last 10 minutes what that cost when he failed at it. The cow in the second stall would die within the hour and take the calf with her unless somebody got a hand in and turned it. The willow gaps would keep feeding snow against the south face of the barn until the door was buried, and a buried door in a 29 below wind meant 81 head shut in with no water and no feed and no way to get to them until the drift thawed in March. And somewhere between here and the Greeley line, there was a 16-year-old boy on the ground. Mara had helped turn a calf 3 nights ago with her hands in the straw beside his. "The black cow's yours," Harlan said. "You've done it once. It's the same thing. Don't hurry it, and don't pull against her." She lit the second lamp and set it in the kitchen window and took the lantern down off its hook and did not argue which was its own kind of answer. At the door he stopped with his hand on the frame. "Then the trees," she said. "No, the boy first." She turned around at that. Of everything in that night, it was the thing she had not expected, and he could see her working out whether it was courage or foolishness or some kind of penance, and he did not want any of the 3 laid on him. "The trees will still be broken in an hour," he said. "He won't." Then he went out. Silas Greeley came up the lane at 20 minutes to midnight in a sleigh with 2 men and 4 horses, and he came into the kitchen without knocking because the wind took the door out of his hand. He was not the same man who had turned his hat by the brim at that table on the 11th. His face had come apart. He said his son's name twice before he said anything else, and when Mara told him the roan had come in empty an hour ago, he put his hand on the back of a chair to hold himself up. Then he took a folded paper out of his coat. "Sign it," he said. "Sign the strip over to me tonight, and I'll put every man and every horse I own on this place till morning. Your cattle, your barn, all of it. You've got nothing out here. I've got 9 men." Mara stood in the middle of her own kitchen with her father's ledger against her chest, and the wind came under the door, and out in the dark there was a man on the end of a rope who might already be dead, and a cow she did not know if she could save. She did not know how any of it would end. That was the whole of it. She did not know. "No," she said. Silas stared at her. "You'll lose the place." She set the ledger down on the table and opened it and turned it around to face him, to the page with the drawing on it, the fence and the creek and the old sod plugs and the new, the bearings written along the margin, the depths, the color of the packed earth at the bottom of the holes, the date and the hour, the signature. "On the 15th you go and speak to the board," she said. I'll be there too." Then she took the lantern and went out to the barn and did not look back at him. Harlan found Noah Greeley by walking the wrong fence line. He had gone out along the creek because that was where the horse had come from, and in that dark there was no ground and no sky and no direction, and the only things standing anywhere above the snow were the 3 boundary stakes that Silas had pulled and reset 30 yards inside the Ellery line 6 days before. Harlan went from the first to the second to the third, with his glove on each one, and past the third he found a shape that was not a drift. The boy had gone down on the lee side of a cut bank, which was the only reason he was still alive. He was conscious enough to swear at him. Harlan got him up across his shoulder and found the rope with his other hand and followed it back in hand over hand 90 yards the way a man climbs out of a well. He carried him in through the kitchen door and put him down on the floor by the stove. His father was already on his knees before the boy's back touched the boards, saying his name into his collar, and Harlan stepped around behind him and went back out into the yard without a word to anybody. He went to the hay barn and took the tarp off what they owned, and pulled out the cradle he had started building for Lydia 2 winters ago, and had never finished, and broke it apart across his knee. Headboard rails, the 2 long side pieces he had sanded smooth in another house while she was still alive to watch him do it. He carried that and 11 feet of shed boards up the northwest shoulder against a 60-mile wind with the rope paying out behind him from the porch post. At the last standing willow, he made the line fast around the trunk twice and tested it with his weight. Then he cut what was left and used the 2 halves for lashings. He worked in the 3 broken gaps for something over an hour, wedging the boards in flat and crossing the rails behind them and binding the whole of it to the standing willow on either side, and it was not carpentry, and it would not have passed anybody's inspection. It stood. It broke the sheet of the wind at the crest and turned it, and the snow that had been coming down the slope in one unbroken run began instead to lay itself out in a long tail below the row away to the east, away from the yard. He came back down the line he had tied hand over hand to the last willow, and from there to the yard fence and along the fence to the house. The drift against the south face of the barn had stopped short of the hinge side of the door. He dug the last of it away with a hay fork in the dark for 15 minutes and got the door open. Inside, in the second stall, Mara Ellery was sitting back against the boards with her arms red to the elbow and a live calf steaming in the straw in front of her. The county board sat on the 15th of December in a room above the land office with 4 men at a long table, and Edwin March read from his own book and then from the leather ledger for 1 hour and 10 minutes. He did not apologize to anybody, and he did not become a different man than he had been in November. He read out morning and evening temperatures for 26 consecutive days. He read hay weights by rack. He read the failure of the old spring line on the 9th and the full water that followed it. He read calf weights with dates beside them, and the 2 calvings and the storm night and the depth of the drift at the barn door measured at first light. Numbers with dates on them. It was what he had asked for, and having asked for it, he could not now find a room in it for an opinion. Coldwater Reach was graded fit. The drawing of the boundary stakes was entered into the record over Silas Greeley's objection, and the board declined to hear his petition on the creek strip, and one of the 4 men asked him a question about the 6th of December that he did not answer well. He did not repent of anything. He gathered his papers and stood up. His son had come in with him and had sat at the back of the room the whole time. On the way out, Noah stopped in front of Harlan and did not look at his father and put his hand out. "Thank you," he said,